You ever noticed how political debate these days can feel, well, less like a simple disagreement and more like an all-out battle? Today, we're going to dive deep into a really powerful and, frankly, dangerous rhetorical tool, this whole concept of the enemy within. We're going to explore a scientific analysis of how this very specific way of using language can totally reshape our political world. And this right here, this is the core idea. It's a huge shift from looking at your political rivals as, people with different policies, to seeing them as a threat to the very existence of the nation itself. And when you reframe it like that, it doesn't just change the debate, it changes the entire rulebook. Yeah, and this slide just lays it all out, doesn't it? Look, a healthy democracy runs on argument, on debate with a legitimate opposition. The whole point is to try and find some common ground, to compromise. But once you start using enemy rhetoric, all of that just goes out the window. Arguing turns into fighting. Opposition becomes an internal enemy. And the goal, it's not compromise anymore. It's to eradicate, to combat the other side. It is a fundamentally different ballgame. Now, it's super important to get what this analysis is and what it is not. We are not trying to draw a straight line from one historical event to another. No. Instead, we're focusing on the mechanics of the language, the nuts and bolts of how this rhetoric actually works. All right, so how does this transformation actually happen? How do you take a political opponent and turn them into a public enemy in people's minds? Let's break it down. So there's this key concept from the source material. It's called normverschiebung, which basically means a norm shift. And here's the thing. It doesn't mean that this kind of language directly causes violence. It's more subtle than that. It slowly, bit by bit, makes extreme ideas and actions seem normal, more acceptable. It kind of lowers our collective immune system, and it can make political violence start to look like a justifiable or maybe even a necessary tool. Okay, let's get into the real heart of the analysis now and see how this whole thing is built. The source material actually identifies a pretty clear three-step process for creating this internal enemy narrative. It's a powerful playbook. So the source breaks this down into three key rhetorical steps. First is Demonisierung, or demonization. Then you have moralische Entgrenzung, or moral disinhibition. And finally, the Verteidigungsframe, which is the defense frame. Each one builds on the last, creating this powerful case for extreme actions. Let's dig into what each one of these actually means. First up, we have demonization, and this is exactly what it sounds like. This is the point where your opponents are no longer just people you disagree with on policy. No, they're painted as fundamentally evil, as dangerous. The whole thing shifts from a political debate into a moral crusade. It's a battle of good versus evil. Okay, so once you've successfully labeled your opponent as evil, the next step follows pretty logically. It's called moral disinhibition. This is where the normal rules of political behavior, of basic decency, are just tossed aside on purpose. The thinking goes, if you're fighting a true enemy, then extreme measures aren't just okay, they're critical. The usual moral guardrails, they're gone. And this brings us to the final and maybe the most clever piece of the puzzle, the defense frame. This is a brilliant and, honestly, a chilling rhetorical trick. Any aggressive action you take is framed not as an attack, but as an act of self-defense. The whole argument becomes, we had to do it. They were the ones who were the real threat to us. So now that we've seen how the machine works, what are the actual consequences? What's the historical function of this kind of language? And why is it so incredibly risky for democracies, especially today? This isn't some new invention. The source points out that the internal enemy is a classic part of the totalitarian playbook. It was a core piece of National Socialist propaganda in Germany, for instance, used to justify states of emergency and the absolutely brutal suppression of anyone who disagreed. And I gotta stress this again because it's so important. The source is not equating different historical moments or saying they're the same. The focus is on the parallel of the mechanism, the similar way the language is used to get a political result. Understanding how the playbook works is the real key here. So the big question is, how can you and I spot this kind of rhetoric out in the real world? Well, the analysis gives us some really sharp questions to ask ourselves. Who exactly is being called the enemy? Is it the media, a political party, maybe elites? Are entire institutions like the courts or science itself being called hostile? And listen really closely to the verbs they use. What actions are they calling for? Words like purge or root out or military-style language, those are huge red flags. Now, I know this all sounds pretty heavy, but here's the good news.
The analysis doesn't just stop at pointing out the problem. It actually gives us some concrete ways to push back and to strengthen our democratic culture against this kind of thing. So, what can we actually do? Well, the source points to a three-part strategy. First, democratic conflict education. Basically, teaching and reinforcing the idea that having an opposition is not just okay, it's essential for a democracy to function. Second, we have to draw some clear lines in the sand, linguistically speaking. We have to clearly and consistently reject dehumanizing language when we see it and hear it. And finally, we can get behind things like structured bridge-building programs that are specifically designed to cool down the intense polarization that this rhetoric needs to survive.
And that really brings us to the final, powerful takeaway from this analysis, a question that just cuts right to the chase. If the people on the other side of the aisle aren't just opponents to be debated, but are seen as enemies to be destroyed at all costs, what on earth does a peaceful transition of power even look like anymore? It's a heavy question and definitely something worth thinking about.